Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I hope you all are well. I'm Phil Curran, pastor at Columbia United Christian Church, and I have the good fortune of sitting at the table with Rabbi Mikey Hess Weber of the Columbia Jewish Congregation. So here we are I think this is our final discussion today. There's one more, okay. Pardon me. Today is about euthanasia. And Rabbi and I had the opportunity to sit together several weeks ago to discuss a topic that is sensitive, and that was abortion. And I imagine we are going that this conversation will be perhaps as sensitive, or maybe not so much, but we are with friends and we are free to express ourselves and what it is we believe about this topic. And so I would like, if Rabbi is willing, for her to share a Jewish perspective. Do you want me to do that? Thank you.
I got that. Thank you, Pastor Phil. It really is, I love sitting up here with Pastor Phil. It's such a treat and an honor. So euthanasia, in some ways it was easier for me to talk about abortion than it is to talk about euthanasia, and that comes very much from the clarity with which Judaism and Jewish texts, they don't offer quite as much clarity when it comes to this topic. And so I'm going to ask that you bear with us as we work our way through. But euthanasia, which I would define as the benevolently instigating the death of someone who's terminally ill, that's a really live question in Jewish bioethics, and it's always been a very complex topic that requires nuance. And the conversation is only getting more and more complicated as medical advances continue and ways of prolonging life become more advanced. But I'm going to start with a basic statement and work our way back from there. All denominations of Judaism prohibit assisted suicide and euthanasia. It's not that simple, but that's where I'm going to start. And here's why euthanasia is not considered lawful in Jewish tradition. First, because we do not own our bodies. So Judaism teaches that our bodies are not ours, they belong to God, and so we don't have the right to destroy them. The second reason is that each person is considered sacred. So within each person is an entire world, our rabbis teach. And each person is created in the image of God. And so there's infinite value that sometimes we can't even understand, comprehend, to a human being and a human being's life, regardless of its duration, regardless of its quality. And there's a third reason, which is that not only is every human sacred in an entire world, but every moment is sacred in an entire world. That every moment of our lives is of infinite value. Thus, we have obligations to save and prolong life for as long as possible, to make sure that a person can live out the fullness of their days, in order that they can uncover the infinite meaning and possibility of every moment. So if Judaism is a religion that treasures every second of life, I think that very much comes from our ideas of the hereafter, right? That we don't have a clearly defined, we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, but we don't have a clearly defined understanding of what happens after we die. The focus of Jewish faith, the focus of Jewish action, the focus of Jewish life is how we use our time, this life that we have now. And so to end this life erases the possibility for incredible becoming. So euthanasia is forbidden. There are no clear exceptions to this rule, meaning that it makes no difference if a person is in pain or wants to die, has asked to die, or is nearing the end of life. Euthanasia, we cannot assist in their death. And this doesn't mean that we don't show compassion. Of course, we can administer pain medication, keep them company, keep them comfortable, but we just can't act in ways that with the intent of hastening death. So a terminally ill patient in Judaism is called a gozis, which is defined as someone who's going to die within 72 hours. So somebody who is on the brink of death. And our tradition tells us that someone who kills a gozis, someone who assists in bringing someone's life compassionately to an end when they're already in the process of dying, is still considered a murderer. And the analogy is, it's compared to a lamp that is going out. If a lamp is going out itself, a candle is going out itself, and we blow it out or we snuff it with our fingers and it immediately goes out, it's the same idea that we are hastening murder. We are murdering that light that lives inside of a person. With one exception, we are allowed to ask God to hasten death. We are allowed to ask God to bring, we're not taking death in our own hands, but we're asking God to compassionately bring death to another, and that is allowed. So here's the tricky part, and to lean into this tricky part, I brought you a story because we Jews like to lean into our text and our stories. So here it is. This is a story from the Talmud, which is our primary rabbinic literature, and it is a story about the death of a esteemed rabbi named Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, or Judah the Prince. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was laying in bed, and his maidservant went up to the roof and said, "The upper realms, heaven, is praying or requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And the lower realms, the human realms, are requesting the presence of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi." So there's this fight between him going to heaven and him staying on earth. And she says, "May it be the will of God that the lower worlds should impose their will, that he survive. May it be the will of God that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi survive." But then she came down off the roof and saw how many times the rabbi would enter the bathroom, removing his tefillin, his prayer phylacteries, and his prayer shawl, and then go to the bathroom and then exit, then put them back on, and how he was suffering with his intestinal disease. He was in pain. And then she changed her prayer to, "May it be the will of God that the upper worlds should impose their will upon the lower worlds." The sages, meanwhile, who are all standing around his bed, are all praying, 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 praying. They would not be silent. They were praying for mercy so that he would not die. All his pupils and his peers were praying that he stay here on earth, that he not die. So what did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's maidservant do? She took a vessel, an urn, and she threw it to the ground, and it smashed. And because of the sudden noise, all of the sages, all of his pupils and peers stopped praying for a moment, and he could go to heaven. He could die. She hastened his death, right? And she's seen in this story as a hero, this is where it gets confusing, right? Because if euthanasia is not allowed, then how come her taking this action to hasten the death of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is seen as heroic? Okay. When dying is actively happening, we should not do anything that makes dying last longer than it naturally would. So while euthanasia is not allowed, we are also forbidden to slow down death. We are forbidden to quicken one's death, and we are forbidden to slow down one's death. So this is tricky, right? Because where you draw the line and where you understand that line to be is very objective. And the rabbis give an example. If a person is a gozis, someone who's actively dying, he's laying in bed and someone near his house is chopping wood so loud that his soul cannot depart, then one must go and stop the wood chopper from chopping wood. So in the 13th century, people felt that loud noises would delay final moments when the soul would depart, or the prayers would prevent someone from departing, from their soul departing this earth. And I would say that today, those obstacles to death have shifted toward ventilators, food, feeding tubes, etc., right? So there's this complication between when are we prolonging life, when are we fulfilling the mitzvah of prolonging life, and when is it our duty to fulfill the mitzvah of not slowing death down? And I don't have an answer for you about that. So if you ask, there are many, many rabbinic opinions. I've brought some, which I'm happy to share later if there's interest, but there is no clearly defined answer. And so while you say euthanasia is not prohibited in any case in Judaism, what euthanasia means becomes really tricky. So Jewish law says that medical professionals and patients and loved ones have a duty to preserve life. And the doctor must do everything that they can to save a patient's life, even if the patient doesn't want them to. But this isn't the end of the conversation. There is some freedom for doctors in cases where a patient is terminally ill, that the doctor, can't do something that hastens death. If there is something preventing the soul from departing when it naturally would, then according to Jewish law, it is permissible to remove that. So in more modern language, this means that if something is an impediment to the natural dying process and the patient only survives because of that intervention, for example, a ventilator, it is permitted under Jewish law to withdraw that thing. So that's where I'll stop for now. I'm sure there will be questions. Pastor Phil.
So Mikey, thank you for that, and likewise it's an honor for me to be sitting with you here. Interestingly, I find myself more hung up on the issue of abortion than I do this, euthanasia, because of what I understand to be the vulnerability issue, and just the whole sense of something going on, and that something going on at a certain point becomes viable. Here in euthanasia, again, as it is with abortion, that is with euthanasia, that there within Christianity is a couple of different approaches to this. In Roman Catholicism, we were saved last time we were talking about abortion, that we had a Catholic in the room that could help us understand, that we have, I think, today as well. I know today as well. Euthanasia, and so the Catholic teaching is that it is unlawful, and in fact it is defined as intrinsically evil. That was reaffirmed in September of 2020, and Pope Francis affirmed it, that euthanasia is a crime. The Vatican stated, and this came from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And so, as I shared last time, ideally I would like to live personally a kind of an ethic of seamless garment, whereby all of life is valued from at some point in the womb all the way to the tomb. But also life is complicated and messy. In the free church, Protestantism, that is, there is probably greater latitude to decide this, and it is likely based on the given situation that a person finds her, him, or themselves, that the doctors can, with total affirmation, say there is no cure. And suffering is great. I don't know how we can insist on someone suffering. And I'm not sure it's because we in Christianity affirm that there's a greater life beyond this one, but that for me, and I can only speak for me as a Protestant, is that grace redeems. And so while some will say certain acts are evil or unlawful and thereby affects one's future home beyond this earthly life, I do not. I think there are situations whereby a person who chooses to end life, that's their individual choice. And I am in no position to judge that. There are four kind of understandings of euthanasia as I get it, and one of them is active, and that would be like an injection of a lethal dose of something that ends the life. There's passive euthanasia, whereby it happens, you let death occur by withholding artificial devices. Indirect, by using morphine, because we know that morphine sort of accelerates, and then physician-assisted euthanasia. And that is where the doctor actually provides that which is needed to cause death. As I consider the New Testament, coupled with the Hebrew Bible, we know that life is sacred. And that we shall not kill. And we heard Rabbi talk about what constitutes murder. If an individual is suffering and they reach a threshold where they just cannot take anymore, I'm not sure that it's my place to say you cannot. People get in mental anguish and end their lives. And of course we would wish for them to have chosen a different road, but we don't know that road that they are on. We have no idea what demons they were struggling with, or whether they chose to pursue other options, therapy and such, and it just didn't work. I don't endorse that necessarily, but I don't condemn. And people, I mean, it's a tough world, and we want to be at peace, right? And how, if I am lying in a hospital bed and my body is racked with pain, and I know that I'm dying, I would feel personally resentful that that choice would be taken from me because there is a rule, law, or whatever that would keep me from doing that. And that there would be the threat of not enjoying a greater life with God if I had it because I did it. So I don't think the New Testament really speaks at all much to this topic. And since that is where I would draw most of my insight from, I think I would leave it with saying that this is an ethical decision that we all make based on the faith or no faith that we might affirm.
There's a bioethical principle, and actually the cool thing about this discussion is it is a discussion. That there's not, although Rabbi spoke clearly that it seems to be a more significant clarity in terms of the smaller box, I guess, in the Jewish tradition. But the principle of autonomy is really important here. The patient understanding what their ethical responsibilities are to their body, to their life. Hopefully being informed not only from a medical point of view in terms of that consultation, but also from a spiritual perspective in terms of where they are in their own faith journey. So that's the ethical piece. The Catholic tradition, and I assume the Christian tradition at large, speaks to the non-requirement of the use of extraordinary means. So that ventilator that we talked about before is an extraordinary mean. So from an autonomy point of view, the patient then has the right to say, I'm not going to do any extraordinary means to keep my life going. The ethical piece becomes the withdrawal. I had a situation in my own life where an 81-year-old woman was on dialysis, had been on for about 17 years or whatever, basically exhausted from it. She was in reasonably good health otherwise, but had just tired of that basically controlling her life. She had been on since the, I guess, mid-60s, if the math works. And she actually reached out to me just as a friend and somebody that really cared about her to start the discussion. And I cautioned her to have the discussion. She was very faithful. She was Catholic. I asked her to have it not only with her doctor, but her priest, which she did. And the consensus was that the dialysis function, the machinery, was one of these extraordinary means. So if her body would sustain itself, the kidney function would be sustained naturally, then she couldn't do anything to do anything. But if it couldn't, then it would take about 7 or 8 days of her not being able to, clear what the kidney function was. And she passed in 7 days. And apparently at peace, but informed, I think. She was informed. So I think the whole discussion, the knee-jerk piece, the immediate response to the pain management might be the reason to do it, and a good reason to do it. But it's the whole process of the medical piece as well as, and your comment about the doctor having the obligation in the Jewish tradition to do everything. Well, that really does butt up against the autonomy of the patient. The patient should direct, with guidance, but the patient should direct the care, and the doctor should affirm that value. So.
I wanna add, John, I really appreciate that comment, and I wanna add that in Jewish, so how we make decisions is by doing our best to look at our texts and read them together and infer from our texts what our rabbis were intending. I want to resurface a text that I brought within the abortion topic, which was that the patient is considered the expert on their body, right? And should be the one taking the lead on their wellness, on their health, on their recovery. And so I think we can also read that into these texts. So while there's clarity within Jewish tradition that euthanasia is not accepted, obviously with a lot of really blurry lines and a lot of nuance. I also want to bring in that text because I do think that autonomy is an important piece of the Jewish conversation too. But it's one that it's hard to. It requires a lot of thought to figure out how those two different perspectives can live together within one.
Wow, this is one of the most complex problems I think that anybody could.
Pull the microphone down.
Down? Oh, I got short. Okay. One of the most complex topics that we can consider in our time. There are two things. It seems to me that the idea of euthanasia in your discussion, and I guess it's natural, has morphed into the comparison with suicide. There seems to be kind of a dualism in a situation of euthanasia. I think that's an important it just as important a consideration, the suicide or the wish for suicide, the wish for dying, is just as important as what the others who are in charge of the patient have to deal with, which we call euthanasia. So I think there is that dualism, and it's very complex. It's, people are dealing with this every day and every minute probably. The other thing is, what about our legal system? I think it's kind of vermischt, which is Yiddish for really all mixed up. We have laws, I don't remember the name of the doctor, but like 10, 20 years ago. Yes, and where do we stand? I mean, this is not as important as discussing what we have been doing, but I think we should know what is the law of the land, what is it? So thank you, this is fascinating and so compelling and important.
Thank you. If I could just respond to that briefly, I think overarching all of this is what is life, right? Is life physical only, or is there something greater that goes on within life? And so we talk about physical life a lot, but there are other components, I think, too, of life.
I'm sorry, I don't agree with you as far as suicide versus euthanasia. Usually a person, when they have euthanasia, they are at their end, and it's usually medically. They are dying from cancer, they are dying from other types of medical conditions that are probably inoperable or they can't be cured. They're terminal. Suicide could be a young person having a suicide. Usually their problems are usually in their head, unfortunately, mentally, not physically. So I'm sorry, I don't agree with you on that one. You didn't make that
I'm thinking
clear.
of the patient who wants to die.
But it's usually a mental problem, usually when they're younger. When I'm talking about when they're younger than suicide, or all the way up to teenagers or young, in their 20s, 30s, whatever. But it's usually a mental problem, not a physical problem. Could be a combination, really. Could be a combination. What I'm going to ask you is, what do they decide as far as a living will? Everybody, they all want you to write a living will. What does Judaism say about that? Where they say, I don't want you to turn off. They ask you questions, and they say, bring this to the hospital, when you're in that state of really almost at the end, or really a major physical problem. I would like to ask that of both of you, what you consider the living will, whether that's good or bad or whatever. And what do you consider the hospice? I know of many friends that have used the hospice, and to me, it's a beautiful way to go. It really is. The family is involved. The person does not want any more medication to lengthen their lives, and it's in a peaceful setting, and it's the best way, really, except for euthanasia, which I do believe in also. I do believe in it. If it's that patient's, that person's strong feeling that they want to die. I know my own mother asked me many times when she was at the end of her life, please do something for me. And legally, I just felt it would be a big problem for me, but I know she did not want to live anymore. And that's usually when you're terminal. I worked in a hospital 20 years, and I've heard and seen many deaths in the medical records. And people don't want to live towards the end. They just don't want to live. And I can't understand why we do it for our animals, but we don't do it for our people.
So many thoughts and questions within one, so I'm going to do my best. I jotted some notes down. So hospice is very much, hospice is removing the impediments to death. That is what hospice is. So it's a way to hold someone at the end of their life with compassion, with care, with love, and remove all impediments to death, so that their soul can depart this earth in peace. So that the Jewish faith very much is in favor of hospice and living wills. And I think living wills bring in that autonomy piece that you brought up, John, which is so important. Being able to say, when you are of clear mind, to be able to say, this is what I want for myself, and write it down, means that it has to be followed. Whereas in Jewish tradition, not every doctor is Jewish, so doctors are working within their own parameters and their own ethical parameters, right? But if there is a Jewish doctor, what it means to prolong life is without the advanced directives is very objective, depending on who they are and what they come to the table with as a medical professional, right? And so the having the advanced directive brings the autonomy to the table in a more direct way. And I want to put a plug in for our Jewish Day of Learning. Rabbi Joseph is in the back, and we've been planning a Jewish Day of Learning, which will be on November 20th. All are invited to join. We'll be here, and we'll be going into more depth about hospice and end of life. And animals, I have, in rabbinical school, I did a research project on Judaism and pet euthanasia. And what became really, really clear is that animals are sacred, and they are not human beings. And so the way that we think about death and dying around animals is different than the way we think about death and dying within a Jewish framework. So this isn't my personal.
They don't have a soul, is that what you're saying?
No, they do, but it's different, and I'm happy to talk about that at another time. But humans are different from animals, and so I think there's more space around. There's more leniency in Judaism around ending the life of an animal over ending the life of a human being. Do you want to add to that, Pastor Phil?
I would not disagree, except, period, to say that the inconsistencies is where I get tripped up a lot. And so that is why I always try to lean into this whole ethic of life, or this seamless garment. It's easier that way, but it's also more it's not that easy, right? Because there are exceptions. The life situations make such a theory or ethic almost impossible to live. I mean, because we are not only thinking human beings, we're feeling human beings, and who of us isn't outraged at some of the heinous inhumanity that people do to one another. And in the seamless garment mindset, that would say no capital punishment ever. And I'd really like to live into that, but I would be lying to you if I told you that I've not entertained that thought, that if someone so maliciously takes a life, the one who committed the vicious act can remain physically alive. Again, that's not what we're here today to talk about, but it is a conundrum, because all of the issues of life are so complicated in my mind. And I'm less concerned about, well, let me just say, living wills are great. I think we should honor them, and that from my perspective, hospice is great. Where it does withhold, it also administers pain medication. And I think we know that pain medication may actually do some things to one's body to bring about that. So again, it's really, these questions aren't easy. And I think what we do is we tell ourselves what we need to hear in order to feel good about those decisions. And please hear me, unlike my Roman Catholic sisters and brothers, my Jewish sisters and brothers, as a Protestant, I have no real governing commands that tell me what I must think about certain things. I'm given that freedom. And so for me, it may be a little easier for me to say that in situation A, that somebody would want to end their life. Situation B may be a little more complicated. But again, it circles back to, who am I to say what an individual should choose?
If you want to, you can. Why don't you come stand up here if you want, so that you'll be next to.
So, I mean, I'm not sure there's an answer to my question, but I think, Rabbi, you were talking about the Talmud and not taking extraordinary measures to prolong life. So my question is, extraordinary is a very relative term. What was extraordinary hundreds of years ago is not extraordinary any longer. And we have, advances in transplant surgery, and a person whose heart was failing now can have a procedure done where a mechanical heart is inserted. And I know someone who lived 3 and a half years on a mechanical heart. What does the future hold in terms of something that lasts much longer? So I'm just wondering how you would reflect on modern science and, historic writings where there was no contemplation of any of these advances.
That's a great question. And I think
Darla, I think you're right. I don't think there is an answer. It's a great, great question.
Okay, Jews and Christians use the Bible as a guide, and the reason why euthanasia is not accepted by religion is because the Ten Commandments says thou shalt not kill, but or not murder, kind of the same thing. But the Bible is filled with making human sacrifices. Abraham was told by God to sacrifice Isaac. The Second Temple was there. People would come there and they would bring livestock to be sacrificed. There's even a passage that I read in the Old Testament. It says if your son disrespects you, you can kill him. So isn't this kind of like a hypocritical philosophy in the Bible? Don't do it, but you can do it on these circumstances. There's passages in the Bible where God instructs the Jews in their quest to find the promised land. When you get to these people, slay them, take their land, take their wives as your mistresses. All of this happens, but God forbid, no pun intended, you can't euthanize. It's a particularly sensitive subject to me because years ago, my aunt had a massive stroke and she was totally paralyzed. She's in a nursing home, she can't move, she can't communicate, but her brain was active. I was terribly upset and worried about her. I went and talked to the doctor and I said to the doctor, how long can she last like this? And he said, well, if we don't intervene, she might last 6 months. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't stand the thought of my aunt totally paralyzed and can't do anything for 6 months. And I said, well, what can we do? And she said, well, we can make her more comfortable. And I said, what does that mean? She says, well, we'll give her medication to make her more comfortable. And I said, well, how long would she last that way? And she said, maybe a week or two. So I think even the people in the medical profession realize, how stark this is to make people suffer until they actually die. We'll speed it up. They just say, well, we'll make them more comfortable. We'll give them morphine so they won't be in pain. So I want to just get all my those things.
I'm really grateful for that question because I think it's important to have concrete examples, because this is something we can talk about in hypotheticals all the time, right? And this is what Pastor Phil was saying, but when it comes down to real life, when it's not hypothetical anymore, it's hard. It's hard to know what the right thing to do is, and so this conversation is a hypothetical example, right? Or dealing in hypothetical, theoretical situations, and I'm grateful for that grounding. What I will say about hate, I think that if you were to ask our rabbis, a lot would fall on intention. That the way that we act if we do something with the intention of relieving pain, and that might, and as a result, death might come sooner, that's different from doing something with the intent of hastening death, right? And so I think intent for the rabbis was really, really important, and it's something to add to this conversation. I also want to say that the Bible, you're totally right. The Hebrew Bible is full of killing. It's terribly difficult to read. And I like to think of, I learned this from one of my rabbis growing up, the Bible as a account of the evolution, not just of human beings, but also of God. And so that as we go on, we evolve into a deeper, greater understanding of what it means to be holy, right? And so our rabbis do look to the Torah. We look to the Torah for guidance, and then we do a lot of grappling. We do a lot of talking. We also turn to our ancient rabbis. We turn to our modern rabbis to help us grapple with Torah, because it is often confusing, hypothetical, or harmful, depending on how we choose to enact Torah in our lives. So we don't, I can speak to the Jewish tradition, which is that we don't just look to Torah. If we just look to Torah, the world would look really different, and the Jewish people would look really different. So when things are difficult, we see that difficulty, and then we're Am Yisrael, we're God wrestlers, we're charged with grappling with that and trying to figure out how to make sense of it in a different way. And so a lot of this euthanasia conversation comes out of trying to figure out just that, how to grapple with ending life, and is ending life truly a holy, sacred act?
So I would reiterate what Rabbi just said about taking the sacred text, but also including reason, tradition, and experience. I think I said something about that when we talked about abortion, that reason has something to say, our experience gives shape, and the tradition has to be taken seriously as well. But to your excellent illustration, the pain that it was causing you for your aunt to be struggling, we then go to those who have the knowledge about what the prognosis is. And even though we say no one is God, and in fact that's true, medical doctors have done a lot of training and research, and we need to take that seriously and respect that and include that in our decision making.
Just a comment. When people receive a real bad diagnosis, doesn't mean it's so. I got a cancer diagnosis quite a long time ago. I had a bilateral mastectomy, and I had colon cancer surgery all on the same day. It was a year-long walk. But some family and some of my friends, when they heard that diagnosis, had me in the grave. God had other ideas. That was almost 25 years ago.
Right, and that is an excellent point.
Would you repeat that last thing that she said?
I was having difficulty hearing, but I think what I was hearing is that a diagnosis of imminent death, or to that degree, was a wrong one, and that 25 years later, she's still alive, for which we give thanks. And we'd say that's miraculous, right? I mean, there are miracles, and doctors don't know everything.
They don't know.
And that's something. So.
I'm sorry?
They call it the practice of medicine.
Right,
They're practicing.
right.
We're all practicing.
But how do you, right, I take that seriously. I also think we have to take the suffering of a human being seriously too. And so I think this is an individual thing, and it's hard for me to paint with a broad brush on this topic.
This is a comment rather than a question. We recently had a panel where I live of our state reps who talked about things that are on the agenda in the Maryland General Assembly for the upcoming session. And one I gather is what at one point was called, quote unquote, the nanny law, which I think is really it's an assisted dying law, and the elements, as I understand it, are the patient's choice or will, the doctor providing the patient the means, but not actively intervening. There's science involved in terms of, a projection that life could only continue beyond a certain time, and then the other accoutrements, things about family will, living will, suffering, etc. But I think, just to mention, it's an issue that we all may be called upon to think about more actively in the coming year. Thank you.
Thank you for the reminder to keep our eyes out for that. We have 4 minutes until 1:30, so time for another question. Or thought.
I'm just, if I could just throw something in, is it the fear of some sort of, in Christianity, is it the fear of eternal damnation for choosing that keeps someone from considering euthanasia? I don't have an answer. I'm just wondering.
Well, in Catholicism, isn't it a sin to commit suicide? In fact, in Judaism, it's really a sin that so many people do it. Anyway, it's their name.
I think it's important. I think the question is directly for a Christian audience, because the eternal we don't have the lens of eternal damnation, right, when we're making our choices. So I think it's a good question for a Christian.
As Father Bowen might put it, in our old church, that would have been the fear. And it may be in our new church too, in terms of the current tradition or thoughts. The issue for me is that eternal damnation sentence, so to speak, totally mitigates forgiveness. So we go back to Rabbi's comment early about intention. This beautiful lady who has shared the last 25 years with this world could have made a different decision 25 years ago and not necessarily have been challenged for that. She may have been criticized in circles for all the things that we're talking about today, but her decision to fight was as equally as valuable or valid as her decision not to at the time, had she chosen that. So for me, it is about intention. It's about how, again, back to being informed and of right mind and spirit, and looking in the face of God in our tradition and saying, Lord, I'm sorry, and Him saying, come home. It's about forgiveness. So I think the sentence of damnation is an unfair one, because the church might mandate that, but God's going to be the ultimate judge of that.
thank you for your comment. I'm old enough to remember when you couldn't be buried in the Catholic Church if. That changed. And the last time I was here and I spoke, I mentioned that we base our sources of revelation on scripture and tradition. I also said it was an ongoing, evolving, meeting the signs of the times tradition. It's a living tradition. Unfortunately, not everybody takes the time to learn what's current. So I'll leave it at that. These subjects are fraught. There is not one size fits all. But what I would like to say as a way to lift the mood as we leave the room is that we prepare. Jim and I have done everything we can do to think ahead and prepare our documents. Number one, we also live at Miller's Grant. Miller's Grant is providing us with opportunities to learn what is available for us in our society. So tomorrow there's going to be discussion, our social workers and OT people and nurses on Medicare in our independent living, in our healthcare and assisted living. What does Medicare provide? What I'm saying to you is it behooves us to do everything we can while we have our marbles to think these things through. But you know, and I know, that when the time comes, we don't know what it's going to look like. And that's the rub. So when we made our documents, we did make some medical type decisions, but I left room for Jim and he left room for me, some wiggle room, because it may not be clear cut. And we talk more and more about these things. And it's good to talk to your children, because heaven forbid that you're at the bedside and the kids don't all understand what you want. And the poor spouse who's trying to advocate for you, if you haven't taken this on with the kids to make them understand. And I just say education and preparation. Those are my two main points. And I'll also say that in a Catholic hospital, there are ethicists who have to grapple with some of these really difficult situations. And when, for instance, a young man falls down, is brain dead, and on a ventilator, a Roman Catholic sister can come to the bedside and spend time with the grieving wife and help her understand what's in front of her and help her make that decision that nobody wants to make. I think that's it.
I am grateful for this conversation, and I'm grateful that you were here. And I am grateful to Rabbi Mikey for being my partner today.
Thank you.